Thank you.
Can you hear me? Can everybody hear me? Okay, that was very dramatic feedback. It sounded like I threw my son over to my husband in the airport. Yeah, like forever. No. Well, that's it. Anyway, so what am I going to do today? I'm going to cover 3 experimental approaches. I'm going to talk about how these experimental designs can help us construct high-quality, multi-component mHealth interventions. A few things that we need to kind of get straight before we begin. First, I am going to cover, I feel like I'm attempting the impossible, to cover 3 designs in one talk. And I know it's going to be pretty intense, so just bear with me, I'm begging you. It's just that last year I covered only 2, and then a lot of people asked for the 3rd, so I'm going to try and do it all together. That means that we might not have time for questions, but I know you really want to ask questions, so I asked Viva to give me 10 more minutes, right? And I hope you will. The second thing is that all the examples that I'm going to use, no pressure, Viva. All the examples I'm going to use are based on existing studies, but and they're going to seem familiar to you because Bonnie mentioned, I think, all 3 of them. But I simplify the examples dramatically just for the sake of the illustration. So if it seems familiar but not quite right, that's the reason, okay? All right, ready? Yeah? Okay. So another big thing that we need to understand before I start is that many behavioral interventions, and I think that particularly mHealth interventions, include multiple components. And I want to explain what I mean by a component. A component is any aspect of the intervention that you can reasonably separate for study purposes, right? So for example, the topic of your intervention can be a component. What content does your intervention provide? The modality that you use to deliver the intervention can be a component. Are you using mobile devices? Are you using the internet, right? And also components can be any aspects that you're using to, or features that you're using to promote adherence, compliance, like email reminders or prompts to increase engagement in an intervention, right? So to make this more concrete, this is based loosely on Bonnie's efforts to develop a multi-component intervention for weight loss that uses technology. In the process of developing this intervention, I'm sorry, Bonnie had multiple components in mind. These included telephone coaching, report to primary care provider about progress, text messages, meal replacements, and body training. Now, usually when we want to construct an intervention and we have multiple components in mind, what we take typically is what we call an evaluative approach to intervention development. And what does it mean? It means that we typically take 4 major steps. In the first step, we establish our scientific model. What does it mean? It means that we select our distal outcome, the ultimate goal of our intervention. In this case, it would be 5% weight loss by month 12, okay? And then specifying how and why a desired change is expected to occur in the distal outcome. And this also includes specifying your mechanisms of change. Does it make sense? Because then, based on this model, you move to the second step where you identify your intervention components, right? And your intervention components are supposed to target those mechanisms of change, right? Okay. And then using the intervention components that you identified, you move to the third step where you put the intervention components together in an intervention package. Some people call it the kitchen sink, some people call it the black box. Point is, you put everything together nicely, and then you move to the fourth step where you confirm the effectiveness of the intervention by usually conducting an RCT where you take the intervention and compare it to control to evaluate its effectiveness. Does it make sense? Yeah. Okay, so usually the question, thank you, Don. The question here is, what's wrong with this process, okay? Now, there are a lot of things that are wrong with this process, but I just want to focus on one. The problem that we typically have is that we often don't have sufficient empirical evidence and theories to construct a high-quality intervention package in step 3. Because in many cases, our science is insufficient, right? We have open scientific questions. So let me show you examples of open scientific questions. Sometimes we have questions about the efficacy of individual components. For example, sometimes it's not clear which component is effective and which is not. Maybe I have evidence showing that text messages is effective for young adults, but say that I want to develop an intervention for older adults. And I don't have evidence showing that text messages would be effective for that population. So that's an open scientific question. Sometimes we don't know which level of the component is most appropriate. Should I provide a lot of text messages or just a few because it would be too burdensome to provide too many, right? And sometimes we don't know which components work well together and which do not. It's possible, for example, that text messages would work well together with meal replacement, but text messages and coaching would not work together because it's too burdensome, maybe, right? Okay. Sometimes we have open questions about how to select and adapt intervention components over time. And what does it mean? Many of us are interested in developing adaptive interventions, and I'm going to formally define an adaptive intervention later. But in adaptive interventions, what we're trying to do is to address not only the unique, but also the changing needs of people as they progress through the intervention, right? But to develop an intervention like that, we need to know a lot of things a priori. We need to know which component to offer first. Should we start with text messages or meal replacement? We need to know what to offer for people who are not responsive, say at month 2, right? Should we, if we start with text messages, what should we do now for non-responders? Should we continue doing the same thing or add another component, right? And also, in many cases, we need to know what is the best way to individualize the components so we can address the changing needs of people. When I say individualize, throughout this presentation, I mean broadly using information about the person to decide what to do to offer different components. But what kind of information should we use to individualize? Should we use information about non-response status, maybe non-adherence, maybe dissatisfaction, right? These are all open scientific questions. Sometimes we have similar questions, but in the context of constructing a just-in-time adaptive intervention, and I know that Bonnie mentioned this, and probably Donna did too. I'm going to explain later that a just-in-time adaptive intervention is just an adaptive intervention, but it's trying to address needs that are expected to change much faster, more rapidly compared to standard adaptive intervention. But in this case as well, when we want to construct a JEDI, there's a lot of things that we need to know a priori. We need to know which components to offer and what is the best way to individualize the components so we can address the rapidly changing needs of people. Does it make sense? These are all open scientific questions, and we have to be able to answer them before we put together a high-quality package, before we evaluate the effectiveness of a package compared to control. So today, we are going to talk about factorial design, smart studies, and MRTs. Factorial designs, we're all familiar with factorial designs, but here I'm going to talk about how they can be used to answer questions about the efficacy of individual components. Factorial designs can help us screen out efficiently multiple intervention components and decide which one should be included in our intervention and which one should not, right? SMART stands for Sequential Multiple Assignment Randomized Trials. This design were developed explicitly to help us construct high-quality adaptive interventions that can help us answer questions about the selection and individualization of intervention components over time. And micro-randomized trials do the same thing, but in the context of a just-in-time adaptive intervention. Okay, you ready? That's an overview. Let's start with factorial design. I'm sorry. So what are factorial designs? We're all familiar with factorial designs, like I said. A factorial design is a randomized trial, but it includes multiple factors. And in these designs, the levels of each factor are crossed with the levels of the other factors to form a design with multiple experimental conditions. I know it's a lot to grasp, but I'll show you an example. How many of you are familiar with a 2x2 factorial design? Okay. So notice what I'm doing. I'm always starting with my scientific questions. I'm never starting with the design, and this is critical because I know, people who know me know that I make this mistake quite a lot, right? I get excited by a method, and then I'm trying to find the scientific questions that would justify me using that methodology, right? But guess what? That's bad science, right? It should be the other way around. We should always strive to specify our scientific questions and then figure out what design would be most efficient for these particular scientific questions. And guess what? Sometimes really novel questions can be answered with a standard randomized controlled trial, right? Okay, so what are our scientific questions? Should we include text messages or not? And should we include meal replacement? To answer both questions, we will consider two factors, one for each component. You see that? One factor for text messages, it will have two levels, on and off. On for people who will get text messages and off for people who will not. Another factor for meal replacement, again, it will have two levels, on for people who will get meal replacement and off for people who will not. So far, so good? So what am I going to do? A 2 by 2, where I cross the two levels of text messages with the two levels of meal replacement. This will give me a design with 4 experimental conditions. Pretty simple. Condition number 1, people are going to get everything. Condition number 2, only text messages. Condition number 3, only meal replacement. Condition number 4, the poor people, they're not going to get anything. Let's assume that I have funding. Thank God I have funding to conduct a trial with 400 participants. Naturally, what I'll do is I'll randomize these 400 participants equally to these 4 cells, right? So I have 100 people in each cell. So far, so good? Makes a lot of sense. Now let's assume that I conducted this study and collected the data, and my outcome is weight loss at the end of the program. How do I use the data to answer both scientific questions? The answer is by estimating main effects. And I know you all know what main effects mean, but it's basically the effect of each factor averaging over or controlling, here it's by design, for the levels of the other factors. So for example, to answer the question, should I include text messages in my package, I'm going to estimate the main effect of text messages by pulling outcome information from all the people who got text messages and all the people who did not. Now you tell me, how many people will contribute information that will help me answer this scientific question? How many? 400. Do you see that? It's a comparison of half of my sample versus the other half. Do you see that? Right, it's just a 2-arm comparison. Right? Okay, second question, should we include meal replacement or not? Again, this question will be answered by estimating the main effect of meal replacement, by pulling out some information from all the people who got meal replacement and all the people who did not. So I'm comparing people in these two conditions, 1 and 3, and these two conditions, 2 and 4. You see that? Okay, how many people will contribute information that can help me answer this question? 400, right? Again, half of the sample versus the other half. So this is interesting because in both cases, I'm addressing each scientific question by using outcome information from my entire sample, right? Okay, but usually we don't have only 2 components that we want to screen out. Usually we have more than that. So let's see what happens to this design if I add another scientific question that I want to answer. In addition to the first 2 questions, now I want to know, should I include body training in my package? So I'm going to add another factor for body training. Again, it will have 2 levels, on and off, right? So now what I'll do is I'll conduct a 2 by 2 by 2, where I cross the 2 levels of text messages with the 2 levels of meal replacement with the 2 levels of body training. This will give me a design with how many conditions? 2 by 2 by 2? Thank you. 8 conditions, right? I'm just trying to wake you up. I know you know the answer. So 8 experimental conditions. See, condition number 1, people will get everything. Condition number 2, the happy people, right? I don't know about that anyway. Condition number 2, they're only going to get text messages and meal replacement. Number 3, they're only going to get text messages and body training. Condition number 8, they're not going to get anything. Again, the poor people. So let's assume that I still have 400 people that I can utilize. Oh, it's bad to say utilize people. Let's assume that I have funding to conduct a trial with 400 people. Again, I will randomize them equally to these 8 cells. So now I will have 50 people in each cell. So far, so good? Makes a lot of sense. Let's assume that I conducted the trial, collected the data. My outcome is weight loss at the end of the program. Again, how do I answer these scientific questions? These 3 scientific questions. How do I answer them? By estimating main effects, right? So the first question, should I include text messages? Again, can be answered by pulling out some information from all the people who got text messages and comparing it to all the people who did not. Half of the sample versus the other half. 200 people versus 200 people, right? Second, should I include meal replacement? Again, I will compare half of the people who got meal replacement and the half that did not. 200 people versus 200 people. And same thing for body training. So what's the bottom line? You tell me what's the bottom line. What do you learn from this? Okay. Yeah, say more. You should not do that. You should not be doing that. Yes, that was fantastic. Yeah. Thank you. Okay, so what's the, thank you. This is really good. So what's the point? The point you're right is that despite the fact that I added another scientific question, despite the fact that here I have a design with 8 cells as opposed to 4 in the previous design, and despite the fact that now I have 50 people in each cell compared to 100 in the previous design, right? All else being equal, I'm not losing power for addressing my scientific questions. I will still answer scientific questions about screening components, about selecting components to my intervention package by using outcome information from half of my sample, comparing it to the other half. That's the point. And this relates to what is known as the recycling feature of Factorial Designs. And what does it mean, this recycling feature? It means that outcome information from the same participant, say a participant in condition number 1. A participant in condition number 1 contributes information that is used to answer 3 scientific questions, right? It's being used and reused to answer more than one scientific question. Now, the most important thing to keep in mind about this recycling feature relates to your question. It's true that by going with this design, the one with the 8 cells compared with the 4 cells, with the 2 by 2 by 2, I am losing power to compare individual experimental conditions. I'm losing power to compare condition number 1 and condition number 8. Everything on versus everything off. Would that be the comparison that you would be interested in? Probably one of them, right? Okay, so this is interesting. This is why I said always start with the scientific questions. What were the scientific questions? The scientific questions were, should I include text messages? Should I include meal replacement or not? Should I include body training or not? None of my scientific questions concerned the comparison of individual cells. None of the questions were about the comparison between the entire package versus control. If you're interested, if your primary interest is in comparing individual cells like the entire package versus control, I would not recommend that you go Factorial Design. I would recommend that you go with an RCT because it means that your scientific question, your primary question that you want to answer, is not about the selection of components. It's about the comparison of the entire package versus control, or whatever comparison that you're interested in. Does it make sense? Okay, always start with your scientific question. Done with Factorial Designs. 1-minute questions about Factorial Designs? Other questions? No, you don't. Yeah, no, you do. Yeah. I know what you're going to ask. Yeah. So don't. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
So what you're saying when it comes to power, just take the variable
component. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the way you power a study, you always power for your primary scientific question of interest. And here the assumption is that your scientific questions are about the selection, whether you should or shouldn't include a component. And if these are your primary scientific questions, Factorial Designs, in my opinion, is the most efficient design to go. If you want to compare individual cells, I'm not sure that's the right way to go. Okay, SMART trials. Like I said earlier, SMART stands for Sequential Multiple Assignment Randomized Trials. And these designs were developed explicitly to help us construct high-quality adaptive interventions. Okay, so what are adaptive interventions? Let's define them formally. I said earlier that in adaptive interventions, we're trying to address not only the unique, but also the changing needs of people as they progress through the treatment, right? And to do that, in adaptive interventions, we use ongoing dynamic information about how people progress through the treatment to decide whether and how we should modify our components. Now, the most important thing to keep in mind is that An adaptive intervention is not an experimental design. There are no randomizations in an adaptive intervention. It's a treatment design or an intervention design in the sense that it guides how we should provide treatments. And in adaptive interventions, we provide treatments in a way that uses ongoing dynamic information from the person to decide whether and how to modify our components. So let me show you an example. Again, based on the work of our fabulous Bonnie Spring, but loosely based on it. Let's assume that this is, again, an intervention for obese and overweight adults. I'm starting with text messages. That's the component that I'm providing initially to everybody. Then at week 2, I'm assessing the response status of the participant based on their weight loss. A participant who did not lose sufficient amount of weight by week 2 is classified as a non-responder. And for these people, I'm adding another component, body training. And for people who are responding, I just continue with the text messages. Now, I want you to tell me, why is this adaptive? I just gave you the formal definition a minute ago. Why is this an adaptive intervention? Perfect, right. So you're using information. I'm happy you're with me. I'm using ongoing information about their response, their progress through treatment to decide whether and how I should change my components, right? Whether I should add another component or continue with the initial component. Okay, so adaptive interventions are usually operationalized by using decision rules. It looks complicated, but it's not. You see, it's just a way to protocolize an adaptive intervention. So why do we need to protocolize an adaptive intervention? You tell me. Why do we need a protocol? Why? You should know this. Why do we need a protocol? Come on, try. Because it's nice, because it's funny, because it's what? You got it. No. You got it. You got it? It's not specify your hypothesis, but you specify exactly how you want and what type of information you're using in the adaptive intervention to individualize, to offer different components. And the reason you need to do that is because we all want to be able to replicate an adaptive intervention. If you don't have a protocol for doing something, how can you replicate it, right? In future studies or in real world implementation. This is why we're using decision rules. The decision rules help us protocolize an adaptive intervention so we can replicate it. Okay, so at week 0, start with text messages. Then at week 2, if the participant is not responsive, add body training, otherwise continue. It's very simple. But this description includes 5 key elements. And in fact, adaptive interventions in general, they include 5 key elements. And I want to show you what these are. The first element is the tailoring variable. Tailoring variable is information about the participant that we use to individualize, to make decisions about whether and how we should change the components. And here, we're using information about the response status to decide what to do, to decide whether we should add another component or continue. You see that? That's our tailoring variable. The second element is the intervention options, and the intervention options can be different components that you consider, but they can also be different tactics. You see here, we have 2 different tactics. Add another component or continue, right? It's not different components, rather, it's more tactical decision. The third element is the decision rule. So basically, all this is the decision rule. But the decision rule links information about the participant, the tailoring variable, to intervention options. The decision rule specifies the conditions in which we need to do certain things, in which we need to provide different intervention options. So see what's happening here? The decision rule does this by specifying the levels or thresholds of the tailoring variable that can help us differentiate between conditions in which we need to add body training versus continue. You see that? Without the no and yes, without the levels of the tailoring variable, you would not know how to make decisions based on this decision rule, right? But here, this decision rule specifies the conditions in which you need to add body training. It tells you that you need to add body training when response is no, right? Okay. The fourth element is probably my favorite. That's the decision point. It's a point in time in which we need to make decisions about what to do. And here, we have a decision point at week 0, and we also have a decision point at week 2. Do you see that? Okay. The fifth element is more implicit. It's not really part of an adaptive intervention, but it is guiding an adaptive intervention. Adaptive interventions are guided by two types of outcomes, by a distal outcome and by proximal outcomes. The distal outcome is the long-term goal of your intervention. That's your end game, what you want the intervention to achieve at the end. Here, it's 5% weight loss by month 12. But to achieve this distal outcome, the decision rules in this adaptive intervention, they're designed to target proximal outcomes. These proximal outcomes are the short-term goal the decision rules are intended to achieve. Here is ongoing weight loss in the course of the program. See what's happening here? We're providing more support. We add another component for people who are not losing sufficient amount of weight by week 2. Why? Because we want to encourage ongoing weight loss in the course of the program. And we want to do that because by encouraging ongoing weight loss in the course of the program, we'll be able to achieve the distal outcome, which is 5% weight loss, right? So your proximal outcomes are like mediators, pathways through which the decision rules can help you achieve your distal outcome. Does it make sense? Okay. Summary, the 5 elements of an adaptive intervention. These elements, the tailoring variable, the decision rule, and the intervention option. These are part of the adaptation process. The adaptation process is a process where you monitor the person continuously to obtain information about the tailoring variable. Then you use this information to individualize, to offer different intervention options. And you do that by using decision rules. They can help you protocolize the individualization. And then you deliver whatever intervention options the decision rules recommended. That's the adaptation process. That's all it is. This adaptation process is triggered at decision points, and it is guided by the need to achieve proximal outcomes that can help us achieve the long-term goal of the intervention. So far, so good? Okay, so why do we even need that? Why do we need adaptive interventions? There are many reasons why we should consider them. I just want to talk about 2 reasons. The first one is that there's high heterogeneity in response to pretty much any given intervention. What does it mean? It means that what works for me might not work for Donna, and what works for Donna now might not work for Donna in the future, right? And in many cases, it's possible to identify early, very early, those people who are likely to become ultimate non-responders, not benefit from your intervention. Here, this adaptive intervention is based on empirical evidence suggesting that by week 2, we can identify those people who are likely to fail at the end. People who do not lose sufficient amount of weight by week 2 are highly likely, of high probability of not achieving 5% weight loss by month 12. And if that's the case, we should do something about it, right? Otherwise, they're going to fail. So here, what we decided to do is we decided to add body training, right, to prevent them from failing. And people who are doing okay, we just leave them alone. So the first motivation is to identify early participants who are likely to become ultimate non-responders and modifying your intervention components to prevent them from falling behind. Does it make sense? Second reason is cost. That's big, right? I think that one of the biggest misconceptions that people have about mHealth is that it's cheap. Not all mHealth components are cheap. Some of them are pretty expensive. And in fact, to me, it seems that the most effective components are the most expensive ones. And think about it, if that's the case, we have a huge problem in terms of scalability, our ability to ensure that the majority of the population would benefit from the interventions that we develop, right? This is why it makes sense to take a stepped care approach to treatment. How many of you are familiar with the term stepped care? Great. So I view stepped care interventions as adaptive interventions in which you start with minimal support. The least expensive treatment, here it's text messages, right? And then you identify people who are not doing so well, and you add more expensive components, but only to those who really need it. And people who are doing okay, you just continue with the same minimal support, right? And you can even tone it down. So here the motivation is to step up and down the cost of the treatment, of the components that you're providing, so we can achieve a more cost-effective intervention. Does it make sense? Awesome. So what's the problem? Again, I always have problems. The big problem is that in many cases, again, we have open scientific questions that can prevent us from developing a high-quality adaptive intervention. I want to share 2 questions with you. Let's assume that it's not so clear that I should start with text messages. Maybe instead of text messages, a very cheap component should provide a more expensive component like coaching. Maybe it would be more effective as the initial treatment. And let's assume that I also don't know whether body training is the right way to address the needs of non-responders. Maybe, again, I should bring in the coaching instead of a relatively less expensive component like body training. So I have two questions that I can't answer based on existing evidence in my field. What should I do? This is where SMART studies can be useful. So what are SMART studies? Again, SMARTs are randomized trials. That's all they are. But they're a special case of randomized trials because they include multiple stages of randomization. In a SMART, each stage of randomization corresponds to a decision point at which you have a scientific question that you're trying to answer about the selection and adaptation of intervention components. Let me show you an example. So remember my scientific question, should I start with text messages or phone coaching? And my second scientific question is what to do for non-responders. Should I offer body training or coaching? What I want you to keep in mind is that I'm considering there are three components here in this example that I'm considering. Text messages is the least expensive, phone coaching is the most expensive, body training is somewhere in between, right? Okay, what should I do to answer both scientific questions efficiently? I can consider this SMART study. It just looks complicated because of all my notations, but it's pretty simple. I'll guide you through it. At the beginning of the program, I take my 400 people. I randomize them equally with 0.5 probability to either phone coaching or text messages. And then I take my non-responders at week 2. I'm assuming that 50% will be non-responders. I'm making this assumption based on existing data. And then I take my non-responders and I re-randomize them in both arms to either phone coaching or body training. You see that? This design will result in 6 individual experimental conditions, 1 to 6. What I want you to notice here is that there are 2 stages of randomization. This is going to be critical when we move to MRTs. The first stage is at week 0. Why? Because remember my scientific question, how to initiate the treatment, right? So I had a question about the selection of components at this decision point at week 0. And I also had a second scientific question about what to do for non-responders at week 2, right? That's the second decision point for which I had a scientific question that I needed to answer. That's why you have 2 stages of randomizations, because we're trying to develop an adaptive intervention to answer questions about an adaptive intervention in which you have 2 decision points, right? Does it make sense? Okay. That's the distribution of participants that you're going to have, assuming that 50% are going to become non-responders. So how do I use the data to answer my scientific questions? Again, let's assume that I conducted the study, collected the data, the outcome is weight loss at the end of the program. How do I use the data to answer the scientific questions? Again, by estimating main effects. Can you believe it? It's very interesting because certain types of SMART studies like this one is actually a form of a factorial design. So the first question, should I start with phone coaching or text messages, will be answered by pulling outcome information from all the people who got phone coaching and comparing it to all the people who got text messages. You see, it's a comparison of half of my sample versus the other half, 200 people versus 200 people. That's the main effect of the first stage component, averaging over by design for what you did for people subsequently, right? Do you see that? Second, what to do for non-responders, phone coaching or body training. Here, what I'll do is I'll pull outcome information from all the non-responders who got phone coaching, and I'll compare it to all the non-responders who got body training. That would be a comparison of half of my non-responders versus the other half. Now, many of you must be thinking, well, she's losing power here compared to the previous question because she's not using information from responders. So how many of you were thinking that way? How many of you? None of you? Okay, so let's forget about it. Bye-bye. Data from SMARTs can also be, no, I gotta make this point. This is not right. I'll make the point. What's the point? The point is that, yes, I'm losing power, but this question is not about responders. It's only about non-responders. That's why only outcome information from non-responders will be used in answering that scientific question, right? There you go. Okay. But data from SMARTs can also be used to answer questions that, only in my opinion, are more interesting than just comparing first stage and second stage components, right? And I just want to share one of these questions with you. This question is about the comparison of embedded adaptive interventions. I want to show you what I mean by that. In this design, by design. There are 4 embedded adaptive interventions. One of them, do you see this one? It looks familiar, right? That's the one that I showed you earlier. Start with text messages, continue for responders, and add body training for non-responders. You've seen this before, right? That's the decision rule that operationalizes this adaptive intervention. Outcome information from both responders and non-responders will be used to help me estimate the mean outcome under this adaptive intervention, right? So people in subgroup 4 and 6, both of them are consistent with this adaptive intervention, right? So that's the first. Here's the second. Start with text messages, continue for responders, and augment with phone coaching for non-responders. The third is start with phone coaching, continue for responders, and augment with more phone coaching for non-responders. And the fourth, start with phone coaching, continue for responders, and add body training for non-responders. I'm very interested in this comparison. Can you tell me why? Why is this interesting? What's so special about the comparison of these 2 embedded adaptive interventions? I'll give you a hint. I said, yeah, so I talked about the cost of the components earlier. The text is the least expensive, coaching is the most expensive, and body training is in between. So what's special about the comparison? You can do that. You can do that. This is the least expensive one. Where am I? That's the least expensive sequence. The least expensive adaptive intervention. It doesn't even include coaching, the most expensive component. And this is the most expensive one, the one that includes coaching throughout. And it's an interesting question. Why? Because it would be interesting to see whether the least expensive one is as good as the most expensive one. If my least expensive adaptive intervention is as good as the most expensive one, what would I choose? Yeah. Okay, let's talk about MRTs. To talk about MRTs, we have to make the transition. We have to make the transition from adaptive interventions to just-in-time adaptive interventions. Okay, you ready to make the transition? To make the transition, I want to go back to my adaptive intervention, the one that I showed you earlier, and I want to remind you that we have 2 decision points here, at week 0 and at week 2. So why do we have 2 decision points here? We have 2 decision points because this adaptive intervention is trying to address conditions that change over 2 weeks, right? So over 2 weeks, insufficient weight loss can tell me that that person is highly likely to become ultimate non-responder. And I want to address that need, right? So I'm trying to address conditions that change over 2 weeks. That's why we have a decision point at week 0 and 2 weeks after. But let's think about what would happen if we had wanted to address conditions that would change much faster, like every minute or so, like stress or craving or location, right? In that case, we would need the Jedi. I know it's pathetic. So what? This is even more pathetic. What is a Jedi? My son is helping me with all the cartoons, and it's good I have somebody to blame, right? So what is a Jedi? To explain what is a Jedi, I want to start with an example. Again, loosely based on a real study, based on the study that we're conducting as part of Sense to Stop. Again, our phenomenal bond is leading this. In this intervention, this just-in-time adaptive intervention, Sense to Stop, it's a smoking cessation intervention. It attempts to provide smoking cessation support, and it's based on data showing that when people who attempt to quit smoking are experiencing stress, that stress episode is likely to lead to a slip or a lapse, and that lapse is going to lead to a full relapse, which we don't want. This is why in this Jedi, participants are wearing AutoSense. You're already familiar with AutoSense, right? AutoSense monitors the person's physiology continuously. An algorithm on the phone takes all this massive amount of data and uses it to classify every given minute in terms of whether there's sufficient evidence of stress. And if there's sufficient evidence of stress, the phone lights up and triggers a recommendation to engage in a stress regulation exercise. So why is this a Jedi? To understand why this is a Jedi, we first need to understand what the term just-in-time means. And that's important because many people think that we mHealth researchers came up with the term just in time, which is of course not true. This term has traditions in many fields, and I think that particularly in manufacturing and education. And in these fields, the concept just in time, it captures an attempt to provide the right type of support at the right time while minimizing waste or any disruptions to the desired process. And there are two things that are important to keep in mind to understand the motivation for doing that. The first is that the concept just in time is based on the assumption that timing is salient in the effectiveness of support. And what does it mean, timing is salient in the effectiveness of support? It means that you have a certain time frame in which providing support would be beneficial, and you have other time frames in which providing support would not be beneficial. It might even be disruptive, right? Now, the concept of time here is not necessarily clock-based, and that's important to keep in mind. In most cases, it's event-based. What defines the right time to provide support are events and conditions. So, for example, the answer to the question, when is the right time to provide support, would be when the person experiences stress, right? Now, think about it. Event-based timing is unexpected in the sense that we can never come up with a model to fully predict exactly when the person is going to experience stress, right? This is why we need to monitor continuously so we can identify when stress occurs, so we can identify when is the right time to provide support. Does it make sense? The second thing that we need to keep in mind also relates to the assumption that timing is salient in the effectiveness of support. And think about it. When is time salient? When is time important? You tell me. Come on, you can do that. When it's important. When do you really care about time? Right now, I really care about time, Vivek. Yes, thank you. When it's limited. When you have all the time in the world to do something, you don't care much about time, right? But when time is limited, this is where you really care about it and you become anxious about it. And when you look through literature in education and manufacturing, you realize that the concept just in time, it is motivated by the need to adjust conditions that change fast, rapidly, over short time frames. And when I say over short time frames, I mean every few days, few hours, few minutes, even seconds. So let me summarize this for you. Just in time captures an attempt to provide the right type of support at the right time while minimizing waste or disruption. It is motivated by the need to address conditions that change rapidly and unexpectedly. To address conditions that change rapidly and unexpectedly, we need to monitor the person continuously, right? So we can identify when the right time occurs. And we need to provide the right type of support as soon as the right time occurs and only when the right time occurs because we want to minimize waste, right? In other words, I want you to notice that to operationalize the provision of just-in-time support, we need adaptation. That's adaptation. I already told you what adaptation is, right? It's the use of ongoing dynamic information about the person to decide whether and how to modify your components, right? And it's operationalized by using decision rules. So here you go. Here's a decision rule from sense to stop. Every minute, stress is yes, provide a prompt, otherwise do nothing. And look at the elements of this decision rule. It has a tailoring variable, stress. We use information about stress to decide what to do. It has intervention options. Here, it's a prompt versus no prompt, right? It has a decision rule. Look, the decision rule here links information about stress to intervention options. It specifies the conditions in which we need to provide the prompt, the conditions in which we need to provide support. Do you see that? So here, the conditions, the right time to provide support based on this decision rule is when stress occurs, right? And you have a decision point every minute. Look at this compared to the previous adaptive intervention, where we had a decision point over 2 weeks, right? At week 0 and at week 2. Why? Because here we were trying to address conditions that change relatively slowly. Insufficient weight loss that is indicative of ultimate non-response. That's what we're trying to address here. And here we're trying to address stress. And stress can change much faster. Every minute or so, the person can transition from being not stressed to being stressed, right? That's why we have a decision point every minute. And of course, this just-in-time adaptive intervention is motivated by the need to address a distal outcome, which is smoking cessation. But to address this distal outcome, this decision rule addresses a proximal, well, several proximal outcomes. One of them is reducing the probability of a lapse. We intervene when stress occurs. Why? Because stress represents a state of vulnerability for a lapse. To break the link between the state of vulnerability and the proximal outcome and the lapse, we provide a prompt. Why do we do that? Because by breaking the link between stress and a lapse, we'll be able to achieve the distal outcome, which is smoking cessation. So far, so good? So there you go. JEDI includes the same 5 key elements of an adaptive intervention. In fact, a JEDI is an adaptive intervention. But in a JEDI, the adaptation is designed to explicitly operationalize the provision of just-in-time support. The adaptation in JEDIs are intended to address conditions that change rapidly and unexpectedly. These conditions can represent vulnerability in terms of the proximal outcome, like stress, but they can also represent a state of opportunity in terms of the proximal outcome. Think about it. An intervention targeting step count, right, as the proximal outcome. And if a person walks by a park, it's an opportunity to provide a prompt to encourage him to take a walk, right? So I just don't want us to think about JEDIs as just intervention is supposed to help us address vulnerabilities or risks. They can also help us capitalize on moments of opportunity for positive changes, right? But there's another twist to JEDIs, to the adaptation in JEDIs compared to standard adaptive interventions. And the twist relates to the fact that the conditions that we're trying to address they typically occur in the person's natural environment, right? So think about stress, for example. Stress can happen anywhere. It can happen when I'm doing public speaking, and it can happen when my son decides to have a temper tantrum in the middle of a grocery store, right? It happened yesterday. It's already 7. Anyway. So what's the point? I know, I shouldn't have said that. Yeah. So what's the point? The point is that the conditions that we're trying to address in the JEDI are expected to occur outside of standard treatment settings as people go about their daily lives. And because of that, to employ a decision rule of this sort, to intervene as stress occurs, as soon as stress occurs, we would ideally need to provide a therapist to people that would sit inside their pockets and would be with them continuously during the day, right? Now, think about it for a second. The therapist would sit in the pocket, would monitor the person's physiology, decide if stress occurs, and then if stress occurs, the therapist would step out of the pocket and would guide the participant through a stress relaxation exercise anywhere, right? It sounds ideal. Not really, actually, but it's not feasible, right? It's not feasible. People can't just, carry a therapist in their pocket. It would be, for example, too heavy. But oh my God, okay, it took a while. But we do carry our phones with us all the time, and you should have seen my phone. It's huge. I swear that it's becoming heavier and heavier, right? And I still carry it in my pocket. Well, not now, but the point is that the phone, despite the fact that it becomes heavier, we do carry it in our pocket. And I know I'm preaching to the choir. You already know that the phone has tons of sensors that can monitor the person's physiology and state and whatever, and the phone can trigger intervention pretty much anywhere, right? But so it seems like with advances in mobile and wireless technologies, we can be there in people's pockets all the time, right? And intervene in a just-in-time manner. And I realize it sounds creepy, but the point is that it's not that just-in-time adaptive interventions, by definition, are technology-based interventions. No, that's not the point. You see, a teacher sitting with a child, helping him through his math homework, she's doing just-in-time adaptive interventions. She does. The point here is that advances in mobile and wireless technology open many opportunities for us to intervene in a just-in-time manner in a way that we could not intervene before. And there's a big difference between the two statements. Do you see that? Okay. But technology cannot solve all our problems. It can't. One of the big problems that we have with using technology to intervene in a just-in-time manner relates to the fact, again, that the conditions that we're trying to intervene on are likely to occur in the person's natural environment. And think about it. In the person's natural environment, multiple demands compete for the person's time and effort and attention, right? Can you imagine a scenario where right now I experience stress when I'm doing public speaking and the phone would pick me to engage in a stress regulation exercise? That would be extremely annoying, right? I've seen it happen before. It's horrible. So, of course, we can't do that. right? This is why Jedis, and this is a point that Donna and I were trying to make in our paper that was published in Psychology in 2015. Jedis are not only motivated to address conditions that change rapidly or unexpectedly, because these conditions are likely to change in the person's natural environment, Jedis explicitly are motivated by the need to minimize disruptions to the daily lives and routines of people. And the way we do this in Jedis is we provide an intervention not only when the person is vulnerable and when there's an opportunity for positive changes, we also provide an intervention only when the person is receptive, when the person is able and willing to receive and process and utilize the interventions that you provide, right? So when I showed you that decision rule earlier, none of you stopped me and said, look, it's a ridiculous decision rule. It is a ridiculous decision rule. I was proposing to intervene as soon as at every given minute in which stress occurs. What if a person experiences stress over 20 consecutive minutes? Am I going to provide 20 prompts over 20 minutes, right? Not going to happen. That's why we're providing a prompt when the person experiences stress and he did not receive an intervention prompt in the past 60 minutes and he's not driving a car. In other words, we provide support only when the person is vulnerable and receptive. Do you see that? Hallelujah. Okay, but what's the problem? Oh my God. Again, we often have open scientific questions that prevent us from developing a high quality Jedi. And I want to share one example with you, okay? The decision rule that I showed you earlier, it's based on the assumption that stress is it's a state of vulnerability for a lapse. To break the link between a state of vulnerability and a lapse, we provide support, right? But that's one perspective. Another perspective suggests that stress is a state of unreceptivity for a prompt, because when people are stressed, their cognitive capacity is limited. And if that's the case, we should not provide a prompt when the person experiences stress, right? So there you go, we have a question. Should we or shouldn't we provide a prompt when the person experiences stress? So how do we answer that question? Lucky for us, Susan Murphy has been working really hard in the past several years on developing micro-randomized trials. I am new to micro-randomized trials, right? So maybe I won't be able to answer all your questions, but I want to give you my intuition for these designs. You ready? So an MRT, a micro-randomized trial to a Jedi, is what a SMART is to an adaptive intervention. And I talked to you earlier about SMARTs, and I showed you that in a SMART, you typically have 2 stages of randomization. Why? Because you're trying to answer questions to develop an adaptive intervention that typically has a few decision points, right? In our case, we had 2 decision points. Remember that, week 0, week 2. Why did we have only 2 decision points in this adaptive intervention? Because we're trying to address conditions that change relatively slowly. So over an intervention, we have only a few decision points. Do you see that? But in a Jedi, we have a lot more decision points, right? We're trying to address conditions that change much faster. So here, in this case, in sense to stop, we have a decision point every given minute, right? Because we're trying to address conditions that change more rapidly. That's why we need a design that will also allow us to randomize the person at many decision points in the course of the trial. Not only twice, but several times a day, hundreds and thousands of times in the course of the trial. Do you see that? And that's exactly what MRTs do for us. In MRTs, the person gets randomized to the components several times a day, hundreds and thousands of times in the course of the trial. And the data that we get can help us answer questions like, do the intervention options impact the proximal outcomes? And under what conditions the intervention options would impact the proximal outcomes? For example, in our case, we want to know, is it better to provide a prompt or not under stress? To answer this question, we can conduct a micro-randomized trial. This is, again, loosely based on Sense to Stop, MRT. It's a 10-day study with smokers attempting to quit. The micro-randomization starts at the person's quit date, right? And again, people are wearing, in this trial, they're wearing AutoSense, which monitors their physiology continuously. AutoSense classifies as every given minute in terms of whether there's sufficient evidence of stress. If, at every given minute, if the person is receptive and there's sufficient evidence of stress, at every given minute, we randomize to a prompt versus no prompt. And with the data that we're going to get, we can determine whether under stress it's better to provide a prompt versus no prompt. But we can also look at all kinds of moderators like location. Maybe under certain locations when the person experiences stress at home, a prompt would be better than no prompt. Do you see that? Okay, so let's summarize. I'm okay on time. Yeah.
How did you decide their reception?
Yeah, so if they did not receive an intervention in the past 60 minutes, they're not driving a car, and also they did not receive an EMA in the past 10 minutes, right? Yeah.
Right, and it's the data quality.
Yeah, the data quality.
Got it. Yeah. So you're defining it, but we don't actually know. Kind of it's an empirical question.
You got it. So we're making practical considerations to decide when the person is receptive, but it's also a scientific question that you can try and answer. For example, if you think about this design, a scientific question is the person receptive to a prompt when he's under stress, right? It's another way to kind of frame that question. Yeah. Uh-huh. Always to at a given decision point, if the person is receptive, he's randomized to either a prompt versus no prompt. And it's the same prompt in the sense that the prompt is encouraging them to engage in stress regulation exercises that are on the phone. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. 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 So first of all, yeah, it's a good question. So first of all, the comparison is within and between, right? So you're pulling information within a person, but also between people. Let's start with that. But then your question, it's a very good question because one thing that you can do is you can conduct a trial where it's an RCT where the intervention arm is a JEDI with a micro-randomized trial with the goal to optimize the JEDI and at the same time evaluate the JEDI with the randomizations compared to control. As long as you understand what you're comparing, that's fine. You know what I'm trying to say? Does it answer your question? Yeah. Okay. I'll summarize and then maybe we'll have time for more questions, but quick summary. Factorial designs can help us answer questions about the efficacy of individual components. They can help us screen out multiple components and decide which should be included in an intervention and which should not. Smarts can help us construct high-quality adaptive interventions. They can help us figure out what's the best way to select and individualize our components over time in order to address needs that change relatively slowly, right? And micro-randomized trials can help us construct just-in-time adaptive interventions, address questions about the selection and individualization of intervention components in a setting where we're trying to address the more rapidly changing needs of people. Does it make sense? Okay. If you're considering one of these trials and you want to consult with people, highly recommend. They're going to hate it when I do that. I know that. Linda Collins and John Ziak, don't tell them I did that. Linda Collins and John Ziak tell me everything I know about factorial design. Really great people. Smart Studies and MRT, Susan Murphy and Betty Ulmer are experts on the topics. Some useful resources on factorial designs, smart designs, and MRTs. There are tons of useful resources, right? But these are I think these are the resources that I typically recommend if you're just starting to. I can send you my slides. You don't have to take pictures. These are the resources that I recommend when you're just beginning to think about these designs, right? And if that's not enough, you can always email me. Questions? Do we have questions?